Under the merciless Arizona sun, the air trembled above the dust-choked street of Red Hollow. Horses snorted and their hooves scraped nervously against the wooden posts as townsfolk gathered in uneasy silence. A tall man with rawhide skin and bound wrists stood before the sheriff's post, his chest rising and falling slow, defiant. The noon light made every scar on his shoulders gleam like silver against bronze. He was Apache, one of the last free ones who had dared to come back across the river to take what the army claimed wasn't his. Around him stood the townsmen, rifles slung, jaws tight with fear and pride. They didn't know whether to hate him or admire the courage that burned in his eyes. Near the steps, a young woman pushed through the crowd. Her breath came heavy, her dress stretched at the belly, hands trembling against the roundness that carried a child. The people whispered her name with pity and judgment. She had no husband, no family left, and yet here she was pleading for a man everyone called savage. Dust clung to her skirt, her hair loose from the desert wind, her voice trembling yet strong as she shouted, "Trade me for him." The words struck the silence like thunder. For a moment, even the sheriff's rope hung still in his hand. No one spoke. The sun burned hotter. From the rooftops, the soldiers stopped loading their rifles. The wind carried her voice down the street, past the saloon porch, through the hanging flags and weathered signs. Her eyes were set on the man at the post, the same man who had once dragged her from a burning wagon when the canyon tribes had ambushed her convoy. That was before the war between whites and Apaches tore apart every promise made under the open sky. The sheriff looked at her, his hat shadowing his eyes. "You don't know what you're saying, miss?" he said low, his voice strained. "He killed our men. You don't bargain with someone like that." But she didn't flinch. "He saved me," she answered, her hands tightening over her belly. "And this child, it's his." A wave of murmurs spread through the gathered crowd. Women gasped, men cursed under their breath. Somewhere a horse kicked against its hitch. The sheriff's hand trembled, unsure whether to draw his gun or cross himself. The Apache's gaze didn't leave her. His eyes, dark as a mountain storm, held a calm that defied everything around him. He didn't plead. He didn't move. But something in that stillness, the way his jaw clenched, the slow exhale from his chest, told her he hadn't expected her to come. Maybe he wanted her to stay away, to live free of his curse. But freedom meant nothing to her now if it came without him. The old men on the porch muttered about law and decency, about how no good could come from mixing blood or mercy. Yet behind their harsh words, something in the crowd began to shift. It'd seen too many hangings, too much dust soaked with pride and revenge. A woman begging to trade her life for an Apache wasn't just scandal, it was madness. And still she stood her ground. The memory of that night 3 months ago flickered in her mind. The sky had been burning red, her wagon overturned, her screams lost in the wind. He had appeared from the shadows, silent and fierce, pulling her free before the flames took her. He'd carried her across the river, tended her wounds, fed her from his own catch. He spoke little English then, but his eyes told more than words ever could. When she learned of his exile, how he'd been cast out by his own for sparing Hirsch, she realized his kindness had cost him everything. Now that same kindness was dragging him toward the noose. The sheriff sighed, wiping his brow. "You're with child," he said. "Ain't no man here gonna let you throw yourself away for some outlaw." Her voice cracked, but didn't break. "Then let me go with him. If he hangs, I hang beside him." The Apache's lips moved, barely a whisper. She couldn't hear his words, but she saw his eyes soften, and for the first time since the capture, he looked away from the rope. That single motion, simple human, broke something in the air around them. The soldiers looked to the sheriff, waiting for his order. He hesitated. For years he'd carried out justice without blinking. But watching that woman stand there, heavy with life, ready to give it up for a condemned man, made the gallows feel colder than ever. "Take her home," he finally ordered, motioning to his deputies. But when one stepped forward, the Apache lunged. The chain at his wrists jerked tight, and a rifle butt struck his shoulder, driving him to the dirt. The crowd gasped. She screamed his name, running forward before anyone could stop her. The deputies caught her, pulling her back, but she kicked and fought, shouting through her tears, "Don't hurt him, please." Her voice rose until it cracked, echoing against the canyon walls beyond town. The Apache struggled up to one knee, blood streaking his lip, and met her gaze again. His breath was ragged, but his pride was unbroken. For a moment, everything froze, The heat, the crowd, even time itself seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff's hand hovered near his gun. The deputies waited for his next word. She stood there, barefoot now, her dress torn, one hand on her belly as if to shield the child that bound her to him. No one in Red Hollow had seen love like that before, not in the saloons, not in the quiet chapels, not in the graves behind the hill. It was raw, desperate, and dangerous. It made men question what justice really meant in a place where every law came written in another man's blood. The sheriff finally spoke. "You've got till sundown," he said quietly. "If you can prove he's worth sparing by then, I'll listen." The woman nodded, tears cutting through the dust on her face. The Apache lifted his head, his jaw set firm. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, muttering, shaking their heads. The sun was already sinking lower, turning the street gold and red. She knew she had only hours to save him. But how do you convince a town blinded by hate to see a man's soul? As the soldiers dragged him back toward the cell house, their eyes met one last time. There was no promise of rescue in his look, only quiet acceptance, the kind of strength born from suffering. Yet she saw something else too, faint but unshaken. Hope, the kind that could make a woman cross every line drawn by men. When the doors clanged shut behind him, she turned toward the fading light, her heart pounding like the hooves of 100 horses. Somewhere beyond the desert lay proof of his innocence, something only she knew. And as the sun fell behind the mesas, the shadow of the gallows stretched long across the dust, waiting for morning. Night crept slowly over Red Hollow, turning the desert gold into ash. The sound of the jailhouse door clanging shut still echoed in her ears as she walked down the empty street, her hands clutching her shawl tight against the wind. The scent of horses and dust hung heavy, and every step she took seemed to whisper the same question. What if she was already too late? The sheriff's voice replayed in her head, that single word, sundown. It felt like a clock ticking behind her ribs, reminding her she had one night to save him. She passed the saloon, where a few men leaned on the porch rail, watching her in silence. Their stares weren't cruel anymore, just confused, maybe curious. Red Hollow had seen gunfights, raids, and lawmen buried under the same dirt they ruled, but never had they seen a woman plead for a man like that. Not just any man in Apache. A warrior most of them had been taught to hate since childhood. Inside her heart, though, the lines were no longer clear. She had lived through the terror, through the screams on that wagon trail. She had seen what hate turned men into. Yet when that warrior had lifted her from the wreckage, his arms trembling but careful, she'd seen something no one in Red Hollow would believe: mercy. That mercy had followed her ever since. Each night she dreamed of the canyon fire, of his voice calling her to wake. She remembered how he looked at her not like a prize, not like a prisoner, but like she was something still worth saving in a world gone to dust. The child she now carried had been born of that strange, silent understanding, a bond deeper than the words they didn't share. When she reached the end of the street, she turned toward the doctor's shack. The door creaked open under her hand. Inside, the old man looked up from his lamp, startled. "You shouldn't be out," he muttered. "Not in your condition." She stepped closer. "I need proof," she said. "Something that shows he didn't kill those men. You treated the bodies, didn't you?" The doctor sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "I did, but the townsfolk saw what they wanted to see. Those wounds, they weren't made by a knife. They were gunshots from long range. Try telling the sheriff that. Folks would rather hang one Apache than admit one of their own." Pulled the trigger. Her chest tightened. "Could tell them yourself," she whispered. He shook his head. "I already did. No one listens to an old drunk sawbones." He paused, studying her pale face. "You care for him, don't you?" She nodded. "More than my own life." The doctor's gaze softened, but his words were heavy. "Then you best be careful. Red Hollow runs on to things, fear and pride. Cross either one, and it'll swallow you whole." She thanked him and stepped back into the night, her breath clouding in the chill. The moon was a pale slice above the hills, casting faint light over the gallows that loomed like a dark skeleton at the town's edge. Her eyes followed its shadow, and something inside her hardened. He had once told her that every soul carried a spirit animal, that his was the wolf, born to protect even when wounded. She wondered if her spirit was the same, because no matter how much fear clawed at her, she couldn't walk away. Not when his life still hung by a rope waiting for dawn. She made her way toward the blacksmith's barn, where a small light burned. Inside, the hammering stopped as she entered. The blacksmith, a broad man with ash-gray beard and tired eyes, looked up. "You shouldn't be here," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "You got the whole town riled up today." "I need your help," she said quietly. "You owe me, remember?" He sighed, setting the hammer down. "That was years ago. I saved your daughter from that fire," she reminded him. "I never asked anything until now." The man's jaw tightened. "You're asking me to stand against my own kind. I'm asking you to stand for what's right," she said. "You know he didn't kill those soldiers. You saw the tracks. Whoever did it came from the ridge, not from where they caught him." He turned away, his hands trembling slightly. "Even if I say it, no one will care. Folks around here made up their minds the moment they saw his skin. Then help me find proof," she pleaded. Before sunrise, he hesitated, then finally nodded. "Meet me at the canyon trail before dawn. But if you're caught, I can't protect you." She managed a small smile. "I'm not asking for protection." Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the wooden signs and creaking shutters. She pulled her shawl tighter and began walking toward her small cabin at the edge of town. The desert stretched beyond it, endless and silent, where the stars burned cold and bright. That was where she'd first met him, where his tribe once roamed free before the army fenced the land and called it peace. Inside the cabin, she lit a lantern and sat beside the small cradle she'd carved herself. Her fingers brushed the wood as she whispered to the unborn child, "He's not a monster. Hey, don't ever believe what they say." Her voice trembled. "He's the only man who ever looked at me like I was something alive." The flame flickered as if it understood. In that quiet room, the world outside seemed far away, yet every sound, the distant howl of a coyote, the faint murmur of the saloon, kept her awake. Meanwhile, inside the jail, the Apache sat in silence. Chains clinked softly as he shifted, his eyes fixed on the faint line of moonlight spilling through the bars. The sheriff sat across from him, pretending to read a ledger, but watching him instead. There was no hatred in the sheriff's Eisenly exhaustion. "You should have run when you had the chance," the sheriff finally said. "Would have made things easier for both of us." The Apache's voice was calm, low. "A man cannot run from what he is." The sheriff sighed. "You killed good men out there." "No," he replied simply. "Men killed men." Not one. The sheriff leaned back, staring at him through the smoke of his cigar. "She's risking her life for you. That woman shall be torn apart if she keeps defending you." The Apache looked up. "She has the spirit of the hawk. You can cage it, but you can't break it." The sheriff didn't answer. He looked at the chains, at the scars running down the man's wrists, and for the first time he wondered if the story they'd all told themselves was wrong. As the night wore on, the sky began to pale over the mesas. The woman hadn't slept. She packed what little food she had, wrapped a small blanket, and stepped out into the cold dawn. The horizon glowed faint orange. Her boots sank into the sand as she made her way toward the canyon. The blacksmith was already there, crouched beside a patch of tracks. "Look here," he whispered. "Horse prints, not Apache. Army issue. Square heels, iron nails." He glanced at her. "You were right. Someone's framing him." Her heart raced. "Can you prove it?" "Maybe," he said. "But we need more than tracks. We find the shell casings from those rifles, they'll match the garrison weapons." They searched through the rocky path as the light grew stronger. The smell of sage filled the air. Birds began to stir among the cliffs. Finally, near a dead oak, she spotted something glinting in the dirt. She knelt, brushing the dust away. A brass casing, stamped with the army's mark. She held it up, trembling. "This is it." The blacksmith nodded. "Then we take it to the sheriff." But before they could move, a voice cut through the canyon. "Don't." They froze. Two soldiers on horseback appeared from the ridge, rifles drawn. Their uniforms were dusty, their eyes hard. "Looks like you found something that don't belong to you," one sneered. The blacksmith stepped in front of her. "You boys made a mistake, Hung-een, that Apache. These casings prove it." The soldier spat. "Ain't no mistake. You tell anyone what you saw, and you'll hang next to him." The woman's heart pounded. The blacksmith's hand hovered near his tool belt, but the soldier cocked his rifle. The silence stretched long, heavy as the desert air. Then one of the horses neighed, breaking the stillness. The woman gripped the casing tighter, hiding it in her dress. The soldier's eyes narrowed, but before he could move, a gust of wind swept through the canyon, carrying dust between them. When it cleared, she and the blacksmith were already running toward the town. Behind them, gunfire cracked across the rocks. The shots echoed like thunder as the sun rose over the desert, painting the sky red. The proof was in her hand. But whether it would save him or destroy them both was still unknown. The sun had barely climbed above the ridge when she stumbled into Red Hollow, her dress torn and her breath short. The gunfire still echoed faintly behind her, rolling through the canyons like thunder that refused to die. She clutched the small brass casing in her hand as if it were a piece of her own heart. The blacksmith limped beside her, his face pale from exhaustion and fear. Dust streaked their clothes, and the town, still half asleep, watched them with wide eyes as they staggered toward the sheriff's office. Inside, the sheriff was pouring coffee when the door slammed open. He turned sharply, hand going to his revolver, but stopped when he saw her face. "You look like you've been through hell," he muttered. "We have," she said breathlessly. "And I can prove it." She laid the casing on his desk, her hands trembling. "Army issue, from the ridge where your men died. You didn't kill them. Soldiers did." The sheriff leaned forward, his jaw tightening. He picked up the casing and turned it in his fingers. "You sure of this?" "I saw them," she said. "2 soldiers. They fired at us when they realized we'd found it." The sheriff's eyes flicked toward the window. "If what you're saying is true, it means the army's been lying. If the army's lying, this whole town's been hanging a man for their sin." The blacksmith nodded grimly. "Those soldiers will come here soon. They don't want her talking." The sheriff rubbed his temple, caught between duty and survival. "If I go against the garrison, they'll burn this town to dust. You understand what you're asking, right?" She looked him dead in the eye. "I'm asking you to do what's right." Outside, the town was waking up, unaware of the storm building inside that small office. The gallows stood ready, its rope swaying gently in the morning breeze. A few men were already gathering near it, sharpening their anger with coffee and gossip. They had waited for this day, the day justice would be done justice as they saw it. The sheriff walked to the window, staring out at them. "If I tell them now," he said softly, "they'll tear this place apart. The army won't let the truth breathe long enough to matter." "Then we take him and run," she said, her voice low but fierce. "Before they come for us." He turned back to her, studying her face. "You're willing to throw your life away for him, aren't you?" She nodded. "I already did." The sheriff looked down at the casing again. It gleamed under the weak light, small but heavy with truth. He pocketed it, then grabbed his hat. "Get to your cabin. Don't talk to anyone. If I can buy you time, I will." When she stepped outside, the crowd had thickened. The sound of boots and voices filled the air like the buzz of hornets. The Apache was still locked inside the cell house, sitting cross-legged, his head bowed. But when she passed by, he lifted his gaze. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The distance between them felt wider than the canyon, but his eyes told her he knew she hadn't given up. She walked quickly, her hand pressed to her belly as the child kicked. Every step reminded her of what she was fighting for. Not just him, but the future that could still be saved. Yet behind her, the tension grew. People were starting to whisper again. Some said she'd gone mad. Others said she'd been bewitched. By noon, the soldiers rode into town. Dust rose behind their horses like smoke. The commander dismounted, first a tall man with sharp eyes and polished boots. He scanned the street, his face unreadable. The sheriff met him outside the saloon. "Morning, Captain," the sheriff greeted carefully. "Didn't expect you in Red Hollow." The officer's smile was thin. "I heard you've been entertaining wild stories about one of our prisoners." "Not stories," the sheriff replied. "Facts." The captain stepped closer, lowering his voice. "That Apache killed 4 of my men. You hang 'em by sundown or I'll assume this town's turned against the Union." The sheriff didn't answer. The air between them thickened like smoke. Finally, the captain nodded toward his men. "Search the place. I want the woman found." The sheriff's stomach dropped. He knew what that meant. "You'll not harm her," he warned. The captain smirked. "Then keep her quiet." Meanwhile, out by the river, the blacksmith was hiding near the stables, repairing a broken wagon axle to mask his nerves. He knew the soldiers would come soon. If the sheriff couldn't hold them off, everything they'd risked that morning would be for nothing. Back at her cabin, she was packing what she could, water, bread, the small wooden cradle she'd built with her own hands. Every sound outside made her flinch. She could see the smoke from the town rising, hear distant shouts. She didn't know if the sheriff would keep his word, but something deep inside told her to be ready. Then came the knock. Not hard, not violent, but enough to freeze her in place. She reached for the pistol the Apache had given her long ago, hidden under the floorboard. Her hand shook as she opened the door. The sheriff stood there, hat low over his eyes. "They're cumin," he said. "You got maybe an hour. Where's he?" she asked. "Still in the cell," he said, "but I can get him out. After that, you'll have to ride fast and far. The army won't stop." She swallowed hard. "Will you help us?" He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "You remind me of my wife," he said quietly. "She once stood up to a whole town for me." They left through the back trail, where the hills rose like broken teeth around the desert floor. The jailhouse sat at the far end of the main street, guarded by 2 soldiers. The sheriff moved like a ghost, silent and steady. When the first soldier stepped away to light a cigarette, he struck fast one blow to the jaw, clean and quiet. The second turned, startled, and found himself staring down the sheriff's revolver. "Drop it," the sheriff ordered. The man hesitated, then obeyed. They moved inside. The Apache stood when the door opened, eyes narrowing. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because she believes in you," the sheriff said. "And I reckon that's worth more than this town's judgment." The warrior looked at the iron cuffs on his wrists, then back at the sheriff. "You risk death?" The sheriff shrugged. "Wouldn't be the first time." He unlocked the cuffs, and for the first time the Apache's hands were free. The warrior rubbed his wrists, then nodded once. "You are a man of honor. Don't waste it," the sheriff said. "Go." Outside, the street was chaos. Soldiers shouted orders, townsmen argued, and somewhere a gun fired into the air. The Apache and the woman met near the alley behind the saloon. She saw him, her breath caught. He looked the same as he had in her memories, strong, calm, unbroken. "We have to ride," she said. He glanced at her belly, his expression unreadable. "You carry life," he said softly. "And I'll protect it with yours if I have to," she replied. They slipped through the side path toward the old stable. The sheriff's horse was tied there, along with a second mount the blacksmith had prepared. They moved fast, but as the sun dipped lower, a horn sounded across the town. The soldiers had found the empty cell. The chase began before they reached the ridge. The sound of hooves thundered behind them, echoing off the canyon walls. She clung to the saddle, her heart pounding. The Apache rode beside her, every movement precise, his eyes scanning the terrain. Bullets cracked through the air, one striking the rock near her shoulder. He turned his horse sharply, drawing their fire away from her. "Ride," he shouted. "No," she cried, "not without you." But he was already turning back, guiding his horse toward the pursuers. The sheriff's men were closing in fast, but he rode straight into them, unarmed except for the courage that burned like fire in his chest. From the ridge she saw the dust rise, heard the clash of steel and the cries of men. Oh, her hands trembled on the reins, torn between fear and love. The sky was bleeding orange now, and she knew the next few minutes would decide everything: freedom, life, or the gallows waiting back in Red Hollow. The wind whipped through her hair as she turned her horse back toward the canyon. Somewhere in the smoke and dust below, he was fighting for both their lives. The sheriff's words echoed in her mind, low and steady. "You've got till sundown." The sun was sinking fast. The wind roared through the canyon like a beast let loose, carrying with it the smell of gunpowder and fear. The Apache's horse stumbled on the loose rocks as he turned sharply toward the river, his bare arms slick with sweat and dust. Behind him, the thunder of pursuit grew louder. He could hear the soldiers shouting, spurring their mounts faster. Each echo bounced off the canyon walls, closing the gap. He glanced back once and saw the flash of sunlight on rifle barrels. Up ahead, she clung to the saddle, her face pale but fierce, her knuckles white on the reins. The trail split ahead, one path toward the dry gorge, the other winding toward the old copper mine. He motioned for her to turn left, toward the gorge, but she hesitated. The horse beneath her balked at the sharp descent. Then a shot cracked, splintering a rock near her head. She gasped, but didn't stop. Fear wasn't new to her anymore. Love had burned it out long ago. The Apache spurred his horse forward, placing himself between her and the gunfire. He drew his old bow, the one they hadn't found when he was captured, and loosed an arrow. It struck one soldier's hat clean off his head, a warning rather than a kill. The man reined his horse in, startled, while the others shouted orders. Dust and chaos swallowed the canyon. Back in town, the sheriff rode hard toward the river trail. The sound of hooves echoed like thunder rolling over the plain. Behind him followed two deputies, shouting questions he didn't answer. He'd chosen his side now, and there was no turning back. The brass casing in his pocket felt heavier with each mile. It wasn't just proof, it was the truth buried under too many lies. He'd seen men hang for less, and he knew if the army caught wind of what he'd done, they'd put him in the ground beside the Apache. By the time he reached the ridge, smoke was rising in the distance. He could see flashes of movement along the canyon floor, horses, gunfire, dust. He urged his mount down the slope, teeth gritted, praying he wasn't too late. In the canyon below, the blacksmith appeared from behind a line of mesquite trees. He'd followed the sounds, knowing they would need help. He waved them toward a narrow gap in the rocks. "This way," he shouted. "They can't follow through here." The Apache turned his horse sharply, motioning for her to go first. She obeyed, ducking low as bullets struck the stones around them. The air filled with the bitter temps of smoke. One bullet grazed the Apache's shoulder, tearing through the edge of his vest. He didn't flinch. He only urged his horse forward, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on her back as she disappeared through the narrow pass. Once they reached the far side, the world opened up again. The desert stretched before them, endless and blinding under the noon sun. The blacksmith caught up, his breath ragged. "We can hide near the mine," he said. "No one's gone near it since the cave-in." The Apache nodded, blood streaking down his arm. She tore a strip from her skirt and tied it around the wound, her hands shaking. "You're losing blood," she whispered. He looked down at her, calm as ever. "Not enough to stop me." The blacksmith looked between them, unease growing in his eyes. "If the sheriff doesn't hold those soldiers back, they'll track us before sundown." The Apache's gaze turned toward the horizon. "Then we must finish this before the sun sleeps." Back in Red Hollow, the soldiers had taken the town hostage. The captain barked orders, rounding up every man who could hold a rifle. The sheriff rode into the chaos and was met with a line of guns pointed his way. "You let him go?" the captain hissed, stepping close enough that the dust from his boots coated the sheriff's coat. "You and that woman are harboring a murderer." The sheriff didn't blink. "You didn't kill your men." "You did." He tossed the brass casing at the captain's feet. "That's army issue. Don't pretend you don't recognize it." The captain's jaw tightened, but he forced a smirk. "Careful, Sheriff. You start accusing the army, and this whole town will burn before sunrise." The sheriff leaned closer. "Tss. Then I reckon it's time someone lit the truth." The captain's hand moved toward his revolver, but the sheriff was faster. He drew and fired a single shot, hitting the ground just beside the captain's boot. The whole street went silent. "Tell your men to stand down," the sheriff said. "You want a war? You'll get one, but not with the Apache. It's with me." The captain's eyes burned with fury, but he lifted a hand, signaling his men to hold. The sheriff mounted up again, turning toward the trail. He knew he couldn't go back after this. Red Hollow would remember him as the lawman who turned outlaw for justice. By the time he reached the copper mine, the air was thick with tension. The woman sat beside the entrance, pressing a damp cloth to the Apache's wound. The blacksmith stood guard, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the horizon. "They're coming," the sheriff said, dismounting. "Half the army, maybe more." "You need to move now." The woman shook her head. "Can't. He can barely ride." The Apache's voice was steady. "I will not hide while others bleed for me." He pushed himself to his feet, staggering slightly. "This ends today." The sheriff met his eyes. "If we fight, we all die." "Then we die free," the Apache replied. The wind rose again, carrying the faint sound of distant hoofbeats. They didn't have long. The woman looked at the sheriff, her face pale but resolute. "If they kill him, they kill my child too." He looked at her, understanding in his eyes. "And we make them see what they're doing. Not with bullets. With truth." He handed her the casing. "Keep this safe. By fall, you show it to every town between here and Tucson. And make them know who the real killers are." She nodded, clutching it to her chest. The sound of the approaching soldiers grew louder shouts, metal, and the sharp crack of gunfire echoing off the cliffs. The Apache stood at the mouth of the mine, bow in hand, watching the dust cloud draw closer. The sheriff took position beside him, rifle ready. The blacksmith loaded his last few rounds. As the first soldiers appeared, the air turned thick with tension. The captain led them, his face grim beneath his hat. He raised a hand. "You can end this now," he shouted. "Turn him over, and maybe I'll let you live." The sheriff's answer came cold and steady. "You've lied enough for one lifetime." The captain's hand dropped. Fire. Gunfire exploded across the desert. Bullets tore through the dust, striking the rocks around them. The blacksmith fired back, hitting one soldier square in the shoulder. The Apache loosed arrow after arrow, each one finding its mark with deadly precision. The woman crouched low, covering her belly, praying for the noise to stop. The sheriff ducked behind a rock, firing in bursts, his heart hammering. He saw the captain advancing through the smoke, his revolver raised. The man's face was twisted in rage. The Apache stepped out, blood soaking his bandage. His bow snapped from a bullet. He drew the captain's attention, forcing him to aim high. "You kill me," he shouted, "but you cannot kill the truth." The captain fired. The bullet grazed the Apache's side, knocking him back against the rock. The woman screamed, rushing toward him. Sheriff grabbed her arm, pulling her down just as another volley tore through the air. Smoke filled the canyon, turning everything to chaos. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the ground trembled beneath the weight of battle. Through it all, she clung to the Apache's hand, refusing to let go. When the wind finally shifted, she saw him look at her with a faint smile, tired but unbroken. His eyes, dark and steady, said everything words could not. The sheriff saw movement at the edge of the Ridgemore soldiers' reinforcements. The sun was low now, bleeding red across the desert. The light struck the brass casing in her hand, making it glint like fire. She looked from it to the approaching army and realized the choice before her. If she ran, they'd hunt her forever. If she stayed, she might die, but the truth would burn brighter than the setting sun. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that comes before a storm's final strike. The Apache tried to stand, gripping the sheriff's shoulder for balance. The blacksmith's rifle clicked empty. The captain was reloading, his shadow stretching long across the ground. And then the horn sounded again, one long, sharp note echoing through the canyon, signaling the last charge. The sheriff looked toward the woman, then toward the sky. "This is it," he whispered. The Apache nodded once, his voice barely a breath. "Then let it be remembered." The riders came thundering down the ridge, dust rising like smoke. The woman stepped forward, clutching the casing, her heart pounding louder than the gunfire. The sun touched the horizon, turning everything gold and blood red. And just as the first of the soldiers reached the flat, she raised her hand high. Ready to speak the truth that could shatter the world around them, the blast of rifles broke the stillness, and the desert trembled under the charge. Ash horses screamed, boots thundered, and voices clashed like storm winds against the rocks. The pregnant woman stood at the center of it all, her dress torn, her hand raised high with the brass casing glinting in the dying sunlight. Her voice carried over the gunfire, sharp and desperate. "Stop. Look what you're fighting for." Her cry cut through the chaos, and for a fleeting second, the soldiers hesitated. The sun had dipped so low it burned everything red, and her figure seemed almost ghostly in that light, small but unshaken. The Apache stood behind her, his chest rising and falling heavy, blood dark on his side, but his eyes alive with something fierce and pure. The captain rode forward, fury in his face. "You think a woman's words can stop what's begun?" shouted. "You're standing with a murderer." The sheriff stepped out then, rifle in hand, his voice steady and cold. "No, Captain. I'm standing with the truth." He tossed another casing onto the sand, its dull shine catching what little light was left. "Your own bullets killed your men. You covered it up to start a war that should have ended years ago." The captain's men looked at one another, its uncertainty rippling through their ranks. They'd followed orders, not knowing they'd been chasing ghosts. The silence stretched thin, broken only by the wind whispering through the rocks. Then the captain raised his pistol toward the woman. "You think you can shame the army? You'll hang for this?" Before the shot could ring out, the Apache moved, He stepped in front of her, his hand closing around the rope hanging from the saddle beside him. With a sharp pull, he disarmed the captain, the pistol clattering to the ground. The two men faced each other, eyes locked, the wild heart of the frontier meeting the cold steel of command. The sheriff raised his rifle, but didn't fire. This was something no bullet could decide. The captain lunged first, grabbing for his revolver, but the Apache was faster. He drove his shoulder forward, the two of them tumbling into the dust. The crowd of soldiers shouted, unsure whether to intervene. The woman dropped to her knees beside them, crying out as they fought, dust rising, fists striking, blood splattering across the sand. The Apache pinned him once, the rope tightening in his hands, but he stopped short of killing. He looked up, meeting her eyes. There was no triumph there, only exhaustion and sorrow. He let the captain go, pushing himself back, his voice rough but clear. No more death. No more lies. The captain coughed, clutching his throat. The soldiers around him hesitated, rifles half raised. The sheriff stepped forward, pulling the captain's weapon from the ground and tossing it aside. "It's over," he said. "You've lost." The captain glared up at him. "You'll hang for this, Sheriff?" Maybe the sheriff said quietly. "But not today." He turned toward the woman, who knelt trembling beside the Apache. "Get him out of here," he told her. "Head south till you find the river. Follow it to the old trading post near the border. There's a man there who owes me a favor. We'll keep you safe." Tears blurred her eyes. "You're coming with us." He shook his head. "No, someone's got to tell the rest what really happened here." She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It already made his peace. As darkness settled over the canyon, the Apache rose slowly, leaning on her shoulder for balance. The soldiers lowered their weapons, unsure now who the enemy was. "Ain't." The sheriff backed away, his rifle still steady, but his heart heavy. "Ride," he said. Before they remember which side they're on, the Apache looked at him, and for the first time, he spoke his name. "You are a good man," the sheriff smiled faintly. "Just a tired one." They mounted and rode off into the fading light, the woman clutching his hand as the sound of their horses faded into the desert night. The sheriff stood alone as the wind picked up, blowing the dust across the tracks until they were gone. By dawn, the army had withdrawn. The captain lay bound in his own camp, his men silent and grim. Word spread fast, of a woman who defied a town, of a lawman who stood against his own, of an Apache who spared the man who condemned him. Days later, far to the south, the woman and the Apache reached the river crossing. The air was cooler there, the sound of water soft against the rocks. They found the small trading post, half hidden by mesquite and silence. The keeper, an old trapper with a crooked grin, said nothing. When he saw them, just nodded and pointed to the back where a small cabin stood empty. Inside, she helped the Apache lie down, his wound healing, but his strength slow to return. For the first time in weeks there was peace. No gunfire, no shouting, just the sound of wind through the door and her quiet breathing beside him. "You saved me," she whispered. He shook his head. "We saved each other." Her hand rested on her stomach, and the child. He smiled faintly, his rough hand covering hers. "The child will know both worlds, yours and mine. Maybe one day they won't have to fight to belong." Outside, dawn broke across the desert, painting the sky in golden rose. The long shadows of the night faded into light, and with them the ghosts of Red Hollow drifted away. Weeks passed before they heard what had become of the town. Trader told them the sheriff had stood trial before the governor, his badge stripped, but his name cleared. The captain was sent east, his lies exposed. Red Hollow itself had changed. No more hangings, no more raids. People spoke less of hate and more of mercy, though scars of the past never faded easily. When she heard that, she smiled softly. "He did what he promised," she said. The Apache nodded, his eyes on the horizon. He carried the truth like a flame. That night, the stars burned bright above the desert. She sat by the doorway, cradling her child now wrapped in a soft cloth, his tiny hands curling against her chest. The Apache stood nearby, silent, watching the dark sky that stretched forever. He had seen death, war, betrayal, but in that moment he felt something rare and fragile. Hope. She looked up at him, her voice quiet but sure. "Do you think they'll ever understand?" That what we did wasn't about sides, but about what's right? He turned to her, his expression gentle. Someday, when the wind forgets our names, the story will remain. And the truth always finds its way through dust. The fire crackled softly, and for the first time in a long while, she felt safe. She rested her head against his shoulder, the baby between them, and listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Outside, the coyotes sang in the distance, their cries not of sorrow but of life. Far away, across the hills, the gallows in Red Hollow stood empty. The rope hung loose, swaying in the wind like an old scar that would never heal completely, but no longer bled. The desert went quiet again, holding its secrets the way it always had. And though time would bury their footprints beneath the shifting sands, the story would live in whispers of a pregnant woman who shouted, "Trade me for him," and of an Apache who chose mercy over vengeance. The frontier had seen countless tales of war and pride, but theirs was different. It was not born of conquest, but of compassion, a fragile bridge between two worlds too proud to see they'd always shared the same sun. As the morning light spilled through the cabin, she closed her eyes, holding the child close. The Apache leaned down, his shadow falling over both of them. And for a fleeting heartbeat, the whole desert seemed still alive with promise, washed clean by the dawn. That day, the wind carried only peace.